They said the house in Lima still bleeds when it rains, that the walls remember the screams and the mirrors refuse reflection where sin was born. But the real horror was never the blood. It was what power did to hide it. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is one of those stories that was never meant to survive. Every copy of it was burned, every witness silenced, every record sealed under orders from Madrid. Yet fragments remained, scattered across confessionals, ledgers, and court archives, smuggled out by trembling hands. Together, they whisper the truth of the Palacios de Aguirre scandal, the event that destroyed Lima's nobility from within. In 1807, Lima was a city of masks, gold-gilded balconies, perfumed courtyards, and a silence that covered everything rotten underneath. Slaves carried water through marble halls. Priests whispered absolution to men whose wealth was built on torture, and every woman in high society was both a decoration and a prisoner, locked in silks, obedience, and fear of disgrace. The Marquise Catalina de Aguirre Velasco ruled one of these houses. Widow to a marquis, mother to 3 daughters, she was respected, almost worshipped. Her dinner invitations were royal decrees. Her approval could crown or destroy families. But beneath her painted calm lived a hunger she had been taught to deny all her life, and beneath her roof lived the man who would become both her undoing and her mirror. His name was Domingo, a slave, a carpenter, a man who had learned to survive by silence, bought for 850 pesos, valued less than a horse but more than a dog. He was literate, intelligent, and observant in ways his masters never imagined. They believed they owned him, but in truth, he saw them more clearly than they ever saw themselves. He understood the cracks in their walls, their routines, their weaknesses, and perhaps he understood the darkness that ruled them. History will say he seduced them. Church records will call it blasphemous, impossible, demonic influence. But what if it wasn't seduction? What if, in that gilded prison, 4 women simply reached for the first living soul who looked at them as human? It began quietly. Repairs in the library, a broken lock, a fallen shutter, moments where power and vulnerability exchanged glances, moments where something forbidden became inevitable, when each of them, Marquise, Isabella, Adriana, and young Sophia, looked at him and saw not a slave, but a man. And then came the silence. 4 pregnancies, 4 secrets carried under corsets and prayers, 4 ticking clocks counting down to revelation. Imagine the terror. An empire built on purity, whiteness, and control, threatened by the truth growing inside its highest household. A secret that, if revealed, could shatter the social order of the entire Spanish crown. Because if a slave could enter the bloodline of nobility, then the divine hierarchy of the world was a lie. That's why they buried this story. That's why you've never heard it. Because the scandal of Lima 1807 wasn't just a sin, it was a revolution of flesh. So, before we descend deeper, I want you to remember something. Every empire that ever existed was built on control, of bodies, of stories, of truth itself. And this one night, this house, this slave named Domingo, proved how fragile that control really was. Once you hear what they did to hide it, you'll understand how power protects itself by erasing the people who expose its illusion. They say that power collapses not with thunder, but with the quiet sound of something breaking behind a locked door. In August of 1807, that sound came from the Palacio de Aguirre mansion, a whisper that would soon ripple through the very soul of Lima. What began as a routine mourning became a descent into collective madness, shame and conspiracy. The day started as all others had. Dawn spilled across the tiled floors, golden light kissing the painted saints that adorned the family chapel. The servants lit candles, the cook prepared bread, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and ash. But absence, in a house of order, is a kind of violence. The priest, Father Calderon, noticed it first. 3 empty seats where the Marquise and her daughters should have been kneeling. Only Adriana was present, her skin pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her rosary. When he asked where her mother was, she whispered, "In the blue room. You must come. Now." The priest followed her through the hall. the echo of his steps colliding with the silence that hung like a curse. The door to the Marquise's private chamber, the blue room, where no servant entered without permission, stood ajar. Inside, the air was thick, perfumed with lavender and dread. The Marquise sat upright in her high-backed chair, flanked by Isabella and Sophia. Their gowns were loose, their faces drawn, their hands nervously clasped in their laps. What caught the priest's breath was not their expressions. It was what their clothing could no longer conceal, the unmistakable curvature of pregnancy. Not one, but three. The impossible symmetry of their condition turned his stomach cold. He gripped the crucifix around his neck, as if it might somehow restore logic to what he was seeing. "Dear God," he whispered, "who has done this?" No one answered. The room swam with shame. The Marquise raised her chin, defiant, composed, and yet broken. "You must close the door, Father," she said. "What we say here cannot leave these walls." When he obeyed, a terrible silence followed. It felt like standing inside the heart of a dying secret. "We discovered it last month," Adriana began, her voice eerily calm. "Each of us thought we were alone in our misfortune. It was only when Sophia fell ill that the truth began to unravel. The timing aligned. The symptoms were the same. And when we compared what we knew, we realized we were not alone, and that the man responsible was the same." The priest's mind rebelled before his voice could. "Who?" he demanded. "Who has done this?" The Marquise's reply cut through the air like a confession from the grave. "Domingo. The slave. The carpenter." The name struck him like thunder. He staggered backward, gripping the chair to keep from falling. For a long moment he could not speak. The very idea violated every law of God and empire. "Impossible," he muttered. "You cannot mean—" But he saw it in their faces. It was true. A man born into chains had crossed the invisible wall separating the pure from the profane. He had entered not only their chambers but their bloodlines, and in that act he had undone centuries of hierarchy. The Marquise continued, her tone now stripped of hesitation. "He came to us in innocence, to repair furniture, to fix a lock, to replace a shelf, always under the guise of work, always respectful, always quiet, until one day we realized we had given him something we could never take back." The priest wanted to believe they had been forced, that this was sin inflicted, not chosen. But there was something in her eyes, a glint of will, of forbidden recognition, that unsettled him more than the confession itself. It was as if she was saying— He spoke then, grasping for doctrine. "You understand the gravity of this? If the Viceroy learns of it, the punishment is death, not only for him but for you. The law will show no mercy. The crown cannot allow—" The Marquise cut him off. "No, there will be no crown, no Viceroy, no church. There will be only silence. Do you understand me? This family will not be destroyed because of one man's existence." The priest hesitated. "But the children—" Adriana's calm voice interrupted, precise, rehearsed. "Each will be sent away, raised in secrecy. We have friends, loyal families in other cities. Arequipa, Cusco, Trujillo. No one will ever connect them to us. And Domingo, he will disappear." Sophia, the youngest, finally spoke, her voice trembling, her hands clenched in her lap. "Please don't kill him." The others turned sharply. Her words seemed to pierce something unspoken in the room. The priest stared at her, incredulous. "My child, what he has done," she interrupted, "is remind us that we are alive in a house that worships death. We were born in cages, Father. He only found the keys. Her words hung in the air, dangerous and raw. The Marquise's face hardened. For a moment, the mask of nobility cracked, revealing a storm beneath. But then, slowly, she nodded. "She's right," she said. "Killing him would expose us. It would bring questions. Let him vanish, alive but voiceless." The priest realized in that moment that he was no longer a confessor. He was a conspirator. Every instinct in him screamed that this was blasphemy, heresy, sin. But another voice, darker and more human, whispered that perhaps this was justice, the kind the church would never acknowledge. He swallowed the lump in his throat and asked the question that would seal his fate. "What would you have me do?" The Marquise looked at him, her eyes black as obsidian. "You will tell him he's being sent away. You will hear his final confession if he wishes to give one. Then you will ensure that he never sets foot in Lima again." Outside, through the shuttered windows, the city carried on, the sound of hooves, distant bells, the hum of ordinary life. None of them knew that inside the Blue Room, an empire's quiet apocalypse had begun. 4 women had conceived the unthinkable. A priest had sanctified silence, and a man named Domingo, somewhere in the courtyard, still believed he was just fixing a table. But history was already carving his name into the wound of a nation. The walls of that house would never breathe the same again. The courtyard smelled of cedar shavings and sweat. Sunlight dripped through the slats of the workshop roof, catching the slow rhythm of a man planing wood. Domingo worked in silence, sleeves rolled to the elbows, back glistening in the heat. His hands moved with precision, his eyes calm, the eyes of someone who had long ago accepted that survival meant stillness. He did not yet know that the world outside that workshop had turned against him. The door opened softly. Father Calderon entered, flanked by 2 guards from the household staff. Domingo looked up, his movements halting mid-stroke, the blade pausing against the grain. "Father," he said in perfect Spanish, voice steady, respectful. "Do you require repair in the chapel?" The priest's throat tightened. For a moment he almost pitied him. The simplicity of that question, the quiet dignity of a man unaware that he was about to be erased. "Domingo," he began, "you must put down your tools." The carpenter obeyed, wiping his hands on his apron. "You are to come with me to the confessional. The lady of the house requests that you receive spiritual counsel." Domingo frowned slightly but nodded. "As you wish, Father." He removed his apron and followed. His steps were quiet, measured, not fearful, almost curious. They walked through the corridors in silence. The servants who crossed their path averted their eyes. Some knew. Others only sensed the tension coiled in the air, like a storm about to break. When they reached the small chapel, Father Calderon dismissed the guards and gestured for Domingo to sit on the wooden bench beside the altar. The priest closed the door, sealing them in. The air smelled of wax and incense, holy things made heavy by what was about to happen. "My son," he began, "you must tell me the truth. What has occurred in this house?" Domingo's eyes did not move. "Truth, Father, depends on who owns it." The priest blinked. The response was too sharp, too aware. "You know what I mean," he pressed. "The women of this household, all 4, carry shame. Do you deny your involvement?" Domingo's jaw flexed. He looked toward the crucifix at the far end of the chapel and said, "I do not deny what cannot be denied." The priest exhaled, his voice rising. "Then you confess to the crime?" Domingo turned to him, gaze unwavering. "A crime implies choice. I had none, Father, nor did they." Calderon hesitated. "You mean you were forced?" Domingo shook his head. "No, I mean we were all bound by chains, though theirs were made of gold and mine of iron. You call it sin because the law of men cannot imagine love between unequals." The word hung in the air like smoke. "Love." The priest flinched as if struck. "Blasphemy," he whispered. "You dare call what happened here love?" Domingo leaned forward, his tone calm, deliberate. "Tell me, Father,
We.
Do you call it when two souls find each other in darkness, when a woman who has never been seen as human looks at a man who has never been treated as one, and they recognize the same wound? If that is not love, then perhaps you have never known it. Calderon's hands shook. He wanted to strike the man, to silence the heresy spilling into sacred air, but something deeper, something dangerous, held him still. There was truth in the blasphemy, a truth that terrified him because it made sense. "Do you understand," he said finally, "what your actions have done? You have doomed them all. You have brought ruin to this house and death to yourself." Domingo smiled faintly, a weary, almost merciful smile. "No, Father. I have only shown them what ruin already lived here." Silence followed, the kind that rearranges a man's faith. The priest rose, pacing, his cassock dragging against the floor. "They will not kill you," he said, as if convincing himself. "They will send you away. You will vanish, and your name will be forgotten." Domingo tilted his head. "Names are the only things that survive, Father. Stone crumbles, blood dries, but stories endure. Even lies become truth if told often enough." Calderon turned, his patience breaking. "This is not philosophy, you fool. This is judgment." He slammed his hand on the altar. "Do you not fear the wrath of God?" Domingo's gaze softened. "I have met your God, Father." He sat in the parlor while men were whipped in the courtyard. He blessed masters who traded flesh for silver. If that is wrath, then I have lived inside his mouth all my life. The priest froze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Something shifted in the air, not defiance, but revelation. Calderon realized that this man, this slave, was freer in his chains than he was in his robes. He whispered, almost to himself, "You do not understand the world you've destroyed." Domingo answered quietly, "I understand it better than those who built it." Outside, footsteps echoed. The Marquise. She entered, pale and trembling, her presence commanding yet fragile. "It is done, Father?" she asked. The priest looked at her, and then at Domingo. "He has confessed." The Marquise nodded. "Then he must leave by nightfall. A carriage waits at the back gate. He is to be delivered to the port of Callao. The papers say he is being transferred to a plantation in the north. You will accompany him, Father. Ensure he boards the ship." Domingo's voice broke the moment. "And my children?" She turned sharply as if struck by lightning. "They are not yours. Nothing of you remains here." His expression did not change, but his eyes, they darkened like an eclipse crossing a sun. "Then may the house you protect devour itself, Senora, for what you hide will not stay buried." Her lips tightened. "You presume too much power for a man who owns none." "That," Domingo said softly, "is what makes it dangerous." The priest saw it then. Two worlds colliding inside that chapel, the dying empire, and the truth it feared most. He felt a chill, the kind that comes when prophecy sounds like defiance. That night, as the city slept beneath its veil of Catholic silence, a carriage rolled through the back gate of the Palacio de Agutira. Inside sat a man bound not by chains, but by history. The guards thought that he were escorting a slave to exile. They were wrong. They were carrying a legend into the dark. No one in Lima saw Domingo again, but his absence, his silence, became the loudest sound the city had ever known. The carriage left the palace at midnight. The moon followed it like a witness refusing to look away. Domingo sat inside, wrists bound, his eyes fixed on the horizon that never seemed to move. The cobblestones echoed with the hollow sound of hooves and guilt. The guards whispered to one another, unsure what crime justified the journey. No one had told them, only that it concerned the honor of the Senora. In Lima, that phrase could mean anything from theft to treason. It meant everything and nothing. Power disguised its rot with etiquette. By dawn, the carriage reached Callao, the harbor where men vanished. Ships moored like ghosts, masts swaying against the fog. The priest had barely spoken during the ride. He stared at his own reflection in the window, wondering at what point he had become a keeper of lies. The Marquise had begged him to ensure silence, but it was his conscience that screamed the loudest. As they approached the dock, Domingo turned to him. "Tell me, Father," he said softly, "when you pray tonight, will you ask forgiveness for me or for yourself?" Calderon didn't answer. He couldn't. He had once believed confession purified. Now he understood that some truths do not cleanse. They stain. The ship's captain took the papers without question. A slave transfer to a northern plantation. Routine. Mundane. A man reduced again to property, catalogued, erased. The priest watched as Domingo walked up the plank, every step a quiet defiance against the universe that tried to unmake him. He never looked back. The gangway lifted, ropes tightened, and by sunrise the vessel was a shadow disappearing into the Pacific mist. The priest stood there long after the ship was gone. Something inside him had died. The silence felt heavier than sin. When he returned to Lima, he found the Marquise in her private garden, surrounded by lilies that smelled too sweet, too artificial. She did not look up when he entered. "It is done," he said. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then we are saved." But the word saved hung between them like a curse. The weeks that followed were strange, suspended in a tension that everyone felt but no one dared name. The household servants avoided the blue room. The sound of laughter had vanished from the halls. The daughters moved like ghosts, silent, detached, waiting for something none of them could define. Father Calderon continued his visits, offering confession that neither party believed in anymore. Every prayer felt like an act of theater, rehearsed for a God who had stopped listening. In September, the first of the births occurred. Isabella's child, a boy, pale skin, black hair, eyes too dark to belong to her lineage. The midwife gasped when she saw him, but the Marquise's glare silenced her instantly. "He will be sent to Arequipa," she said coldly. "There is a cousin who owes me a favor." Within 3 days, the infant was gone. Adriana's child came next. A girl. Quiet, almost solemn, born with a strange mark on her wrist, like a burn in the shape of a crescent. The priest baptized her in secrecy, his hands trembling. "She shall be named Esperanza," Adriana whispered. "Hope." But no one spoke the name aloud again. She too vanished within, a week carried by trusted servants to Cusco. Sophia's labor was difficult. Too young, too fragile. The baby survived, but barely. A girl, small and fierce, who screamed as if already aware of the world she'd been born into. The Marquise ordered her sent away immediately to Trujillo, far from Lima's eyes. Sophia wept as the carriage departed. The Marquise did not comfort her. The final birth came last. The Marquise's own. A stillborn boy. The physician claimed the cord had twisted, strangling him before the final breath. Some said it was mercy. Others said it was divine judgment. She buried him beneath the chapel floor without ceremony. By the end of that winter, the house of de Agutira was once again immaculate. Polished floors, repainted walls, every trace of scandal scrubbed clean. But something in the air had changed. Visitors noticed it without knowing why, an unease that clung to the corridors like dampness. The servants whispered that they heard crying in the night, faint, distant, echoing from rooms long empty. Others claimed the mirrors in the blue room no longer reflected faces clearly, as though light itself refused to witness the lie. Outside those walls, Lima continued to thrive on illusion. The church blessed the wealthy, the viceroy dined with nobles, and sermons preached obedience while revolution brewed in the mountains. The scandal never reached the newspapers, nor the crown. Officially, nothing had happened, but beneath the surface, the story began to move. Secrets, once buried, have roots, and the soil of power is always porous. Rumors first appeared among the servants, then among merchants, then in the confessionals where the priest heard echoes of his own guilt whispered back to him. 4 women, 1 man, 1 sin that could ruin them all. He began to drink. Wine, meant for communion, now dulled his mind at night. His sermons grew darker, less about redemption and more about the futility of it. He dreamed of the ship, the fog, the sound of Domingo's voice asking that impossible question. Whose forgiveness will you seek? One evening, as he walked past the palace, he saw a flicker of movement in the courtyard. For a moment, he thought it was Domingo. Same posture, same slow turn of the head. He blinked, and it was gone. Perhaps memory, perhaps something else. Guilt can raise the dead more reliably than prayer. Inside, the Marquise sat by the window, staring at the sky. Her daughters had become shadows of themselves. Isabella spoke little. Adriana buried herself in accounting ledgers, and Sophia wandered the halls humming lullabies to a child no one dared mention. The mansion was silent now, but it was not peace. It was containment, the calm of a sealed tomb. Lima had forgotten Domingo, but history had not. The empire could hide a scandal, but not a pattern. The bloodline he left behind, scattered, denied, erased, would not stay silent forever. Every buried truth feeds on the darkness that covers it, growing stronger, waiting for light. And in 1807, the city slept beneath the illusion that control had been restored. But those who have seen the truth know. Silence is never the end. It is only the pause before revelation. Time is merciless when it hides what it means to reveal. For 10 years, Lima told itself that the scandal of the De Agutira family had dissolved into nothing, that the whispers had died, the shame forgotten. The mansion stood untouched, its yellow walls bright against the sun, its gates opening to carriages of visiting nobles who pretended not to sense the chill beneath its beauty. But the past, once buried, does not sleep. It festers. And in the dark corners of this city, where empire and faith shared the same bed, the blood that had been denied began to speak again. It began quietly, as all reckonings do. A merchant in Arequipa reported a young boy in his service who could read and write without instruction, who repaired furniture with skill uncommon for his age, and whose eyes, black and unblinking, seemed too old for his face. He was perhaps 9. No one knew his parentage, only that he had been brought there by carriage under the seal of the Marquise's kin. In Cusco, a girl with olive skin and a crescent birthmark on her wrist began to attract attention in her convent school for her strange insight into languages she had never been taught. The nuns called her gifted. Others whispered she was cursed. In Trujillo, a household servant swore he'd seen a child who resembled both the late Marquise and a man long thought dead, a craftsman, a slave. Individually, these were nothing more than rumors, but together they formed a pattern, the kind of pattern that power fears most, one that cannot be controlled. When the Marquise heard of the first rumor, she dismissed it as coincidence. When she heard of the second, she grew pale. By the third, she stopped attending church altogether. Her health declined, her correspondence ceased. The daughters avoided the subject, each carrying the weight of their complicity like a stone around the neck. Yet fate is rarely content with silence. The empire itself was changing. Across the continent, revolutions spread like wildfire. Whispers of independence filled taverns and churches alike. In such times, buried sins have a way of resurfacing as omens. Father Calderon aged quickly. His hair turned white, his sermons lost all structure. Parishioners complained that he spoke of ghosts and judgment rather than salvation. He often stood before his congregation, staring into the distance, muttering the same phrase again and again: "Truth is not forgiven. It returns." He had begun to see things no one else saw. Domingo in the shadows of confessionals, the face of a child at the edge of a dream, the sound of footsteps following him after Mass. Guilt had eaten the boundaries between his faith and madness. In the mansion, Sophia, once gentle, now withdrawn, started keeping a locked box beneath her bed. No one knew what was inside, until one night, Adriana, restless from nightmares, entered her room and found her sister sitting by candlelight, the box open. Inside were letters, each sealed with wax, each bearing the same initials: D.P. "Who sends these?" Adriana whispered. Sophia's voice trembled. "No one. They just appear." The letters contained fragments written in elegant Spanish, unsigned but familiar in tone. "Blood cannot be erased by distance. When the sea turns black, the truth will come home. Our children remember." At first, Adriana thought Sophia had lost her mind. But then, in October 1817, a ship docked in Callao under the flag of a trading company from Valparaiso. Among its crew was a carpenter who gave his name as Domingo Perez, a free man, born of no record. He spoke with refinement unusual for his class, carried a medallion engraved with a family crest long associated with the de Agutira estate, and bore a scar across his palm, as though marked deliberately. When asked about it, he smiled and said, "Hasimut, a gift from the past." The rumors reached the Marquise within days. She collapsed. Doctors called it an episode of the heart, but the servants said otherwise. They claimed she had screamed a single name before fainting: Domingo. For weeks she remained bedridden, refusing visitors, her mind half gone, muttering confessions to ghosts. Adriana took charge of the estate, while Isabella, now married to a military officer, petitioned to have the property sold, insisting the place was cursed. But Sophia knew it was too late. The curse was not the house. It was them. That winter, Father Calderon was found dead in his chapel, kneeling before the altar, his hands blackened by spilled ink. His final sermon lay unfinished beside him. It read only, "What we bury in flesh, the generations will resurrect in blood." The words spread quietly, copied by monks who recognized their power. Within months, they became a saying among Lima's lower classes, a whisper of rebellion against the nobility's pretense of purity. The church tried to suppress it, but language, like guilt, cannot be exorcised once it finds a host. The Marquise died soon after. At her funeral, held under heavy rain, the daughters stood in silence, veils drawn. Some said they saw a man watching from the back of the cathedral, tall, dark, unblinking. When they turned to look again, he was gone. That night, as thunder shook the city, Sophia disappeared. Her room was found empty except for the letters, the box, and a single carving left on the wall, a hand reaching through a barred window. In the years that followed, the de Agutira name vanished from Lima's records. The mansion fell into decay, its gardens overtaken by weeds, its windows shattered by wind. But those who passed it at night spoke of lights flickering in the upper rooms and the sound of a baby crying where none should be. By 1830, the property had been abandoned, declared haunted by the church and sold to the crown. Yet in the mountains of Cusco, a new generation of artisans appeared, builders, masons, carvers, who spoke of a founder they called Domingo Libre. He taught them to read, to write, to build. His teachings spread like hidden scripture, that freedom is not granted by kings or priests, but reclaimed through memory. To this day, in villages that trace their roots to those hidden children, the elders still tell stories of a man who returned from the sea to remind them who they were. They say he carved one final message into the wood of a church door before vanishing again. You can silence a man. You cannot silence his reflection. And in that truth lies the terror that every empire eventually faces. Blood remembers what power forgets. By the time the century turned, Lima had learned to bury its ghosts beneath marble and prayer. The de Aguirre mansion was demolished in 1849 under orders from the Archbishop himself, the land consecrated and rebuilt as a convent. Yet the ground refused holiness. Nuns reported nightmares of a man walking the corridors at night, his hands stained with sawdust, whispering names they did not recognize. Candles snuffed themselves out without wind. Infants in the orphanage below the chapel cried in unison at the same hour each night. Midnight, the hour Domingo's ship had vanished into the Pacific mist. The church called it superstition, but privately, bishops understood the danger. It was never about hauntings, it was about contagion, the spread of an idea that could unravel the crown's fragile dominion. For half a century, the church had kept the de Aguirre scandal sealed in ecclesiastical archives, labeled Confessio Interdicta, forbidden confession. But whispers of it had traveled further than ink could be contained. Priests in Cusco, Arequipa, even Caracas, repeated fragments of the tale in cautionary sermons. A noble family, undone by their sin, their name erased by divine punishment. What the clergy never said aloud, but every listener understood, was the subtext, that the sin was not lust, but equality. The story of Domingo became a myth of rebellion. In the slums they called him El hombre que despertó la sangre, the man who awakened the blood. His legend grew with every retelling. Some said he was no man at all, but a spirit sent to expose the hypocrisy of empire. Others said he still walked among the oppressed, guiding those who would one day rise. By 1850, songs about Domingo the Builder circulated among laborers and freed slaves, disguised as folk hymns. Each verse carried a message: you cannot chain what remembers. The Archbishop of Lima ordered every trace of these songs destroyed. Choir masters were interrogated, printing presses raided, but music, like blood, travels quietly through generations, and the Church, fearing exposure, began its most ambitious deception, rewriting the scandal into doctrine. In 1854, a papal envoy arrived from Madrid carrying new decrees. Confessions of unnatural union between enslaved and noble persons were to be treated not as sin, but as spiritual corruption caused by demonic temptation. It was a brilliant move. By transforming truth into theology, they turned rebellion into possession, and in doing so, they ensured that the descendants of Domingo's children would live under the shadow of heresy rather than heritage. Yet truth has a strange way of resurrecting itself through those least expected. In 1867, an anonymous scholar submitted a treatise to the Royal Academy in Madrid titled On the Hereditary Transmission of Moral Memory. It described in careful pseudo-scientific language the events of the de Aguirre scandal, without names, without dates, but with unmistakable precision. The author argued that memory, like guilt, could pass through blood, that the body could remember what the mind was forced to forget. The Academy dismissed it as madness, but buried in the margins of the manuscript was a signature: D. Perez. From that point, the Church's suppression grew desperate. Officials confiscated parish records, destroyed midwives' logs, and excommunicated anyone caught repeating the myth. Lima's archives were purged again in 1871, a holy fire that burned for 3 days. Yet documents survived: letters, ledgers, fragments of sermons, hidden by monks who feared God, but feared silence more. Among them was Father Calderon's final confession, sealed inside a wooden reliquary discovered a century later beneath the ruins of the old convent. His handwriting was unsteady but unmistakable. The curse is not a ghost, but a pattern. We called it sin, but it was revelation. The moment the enslaved and the noble saw themselves in each other, and the hierarchy cracked. Every empire since has tried to erase that moment. But you cannot destroy what exposes the lie of divine order. You can only rename it. That confession never reached Rome. It disappeared into private collections traded among historians like contraband, but its words became the seed of a different understanding, that the scandal of Lima was never about flesh. It was about the forbidden knowledge of freedom. By the end of the 19th century, the myth had split into 2 faces. To the church, Domingo remained a demon, an omen of moral decay. To the people, he was a prophet, a man who had proven that power's purity was a fiction sustained by fear. Both sides were wrong, and both were right. For in the end, Domingo was neither saint nor monster. He was the consequence of a truth too vast for the world that birthed it, that domination breeds its own destroyer. And so, while Lima built monuments to faith and progress, beneath its streets the old story kept breathing. Carpenters carved secret sigils beneath church pews. Stonemasons etched crescent marks into cathedral walls where no one looked. And every generation, at least one child born in the old districts bore the mark again, a faint burn on the wrist, shaped like the moon. It is said that if you walk through the ruins of the old convent on a humid night, you can hear a hammer striking wood deep below the earth, one measured blow at a time. Each strike says the same thing over and over: remember me. By the dawn of the 20th century, Lima had become something else entirely. A city of electricity and illusion, where the past was painted over in plaster and progress. The new elite no longer spoke of the De Aguirres, nor of the scandal that had once reduced an empire to whispers. They built theatres over graves, schools over ruins, and declared that enlightenment had triumphed over superstition. But history is not buried by reason. It lingers beneath it, waiting for arrogance to loosen the soil. The bloodline that power had tried to erase was still there, breathing quietly in the veins of men and women who no longer knew their origin. In 1901, during the construction of a government building near San Lazaro, workers unearthed human bones intertwined with rusted chains beneath what had once been the De Aguirre estate. The discovery should have been a historical event. Instead, the authorities sealed the site within hours. Officially, the remains were animal. Unofficially, the men who had touched them reported strange dreams that night, visions of a man shaping wood by candlelight, his eyes bright with silent defiance. One worker refused to return, claiming he awoke with a burn on his wrist shaped like a crescent moon. Within a week, he was dismissed, and his testimony vanished. But truth, even in fragments, finds its way into those ready to hear it. The same year, a young journalist named Rafael Calderon began investigating the disappearance of archival documents relating to Lima's colonial period. He was the great-grandson of Father Thomas Calderon, the priest who had once conspired with the Marquise. Raphael was rational, educated in Paris, proud of his skepticism. But when he traced a series of missing ledgers to a sealed convent vault, he found something that reason could not dismiss, a reliquary with his ancestor's signature and the same message carved beneath it: remember me. The phrase haunted him. He began publishing articles about the church's secret archives, exposing financial scandals, questioning miracles. Each piece pushed Lima closer to anger, but the one he never published was the one that consumed him most: the Confession of the Unforgiven, a manuscript he claimed to have found in the ruins of the old mansion. It told of Domingo and the 4 women, of their pact, of the children who lived. The language was too vivid to be fabrication, too dangerous to print. Raphael locked it in his desk drawer, writing in his notes, "Truth is not about what happened. It's about what refuses to die." Weeks later, he vanished. Witnesses saw him enter the Cathedral of Lima the night before a major exposé was due to run. He never emerged. The article was pulled from print. His office ran, sacked, his home emptied. The police declared him insane, likely fled the country. But in the slums, people began to whisper that the church had taken him, that he had uncovered something about bloodlines, something about those who carried Domingo's mark, now seated in positions of influence. For the first time in a century, fear crept back into Lima's hierarchy. By 1910, revolution again brewed in the mountains. The children of freed slaves, miners, and artisans, many tracing ancestry to regions once tied to the De Aguirre estate, organized under banners that bore a crescent hand carved in wood. They called themselves La Hermandad del Martillo, the Brotherhood of the Hammer. Their manifesto spoke of unity through memory, of redemption through truth. They believed the empire's sin had never been broken, only renamed. That freedom was not granted by governments, but reclaimed by those who remembered what their masters had tried to erase. The church labeled them heretics. The government called them terrorists. Yet their numbers grew. Old families trembled as murals began appearing overnight across Lima's walls, images of a man with a carpenter's hammer, haloed not in gold, but in light, shaped like the crescent moon. Beneath each painting were the same words in crimson paint: "Blood remembers." The archbishop ordered the murals destroyed, but each time one vanished, another appeared the next night, painted higher, bolder. The legend of Domingo had returned, not as a whisper this time, but as an identity. He was no longer a scandal. He was a symbol. The forbidden union of slave and noble had become the prophecy of equality that empire had spent a century denying. In 1912, on the anniversary of Lima's founding, a bomb detonated beneath the archbishop's residence. No one claimed responsibility, but among the debris, investigators found a single wooden medallion engraved with a hammer and crescent. Beneath it, in delicate script, the initials DP. The newspapers censored the discovery, blaming foreign agitators. But those who knew the story felt the tremor that ran through the city. The De Aguirre curse had awakened again, not as a haunting, but as justice. By the 1930s, the Brotherhood had dissolved under state suppression, but its influence lingered in silence. Their children grew into artists, philosophers, and activists who carried the same unspoken conviction that history, no matter how it's rewritten, bleeds through. Lima modernized, but the pattern endured. New names, same corruption. New churches, same hypocrisy. Power rebuilt its walls, yet somewhere deep beneath, the same echo remained. Hammer striking wood, rhythm steady, patient, eternal. The city forgot Rafael Calderon's name. It forgot the De Aguirres. It forgot the mansion that had started it all. But memory is not a thing of archives. It is a thing of blood. And those who inherit it need no history books. They feel it. In their bones, in their pulse, in the nightmares that repeat until they understand. That is how the curse continued, not through ghosts or superstition, but through awakening. The moment a man looks at the world and sees the invisible hands that built his cage, that is when the curse speaks. That is when empire begins to tremble again. Because the real horror was never what Domingo did in that house. The real horror was that for the first time, those born to obey saw themselves in the mirror and recognized the lie that ruled them. And once a lie is seen, it can never be unseen. By the middle of the 20th century, Lima had been remade again. Radio towers instead of bell towers, banks instead of cathedrals, ministries in place of mansions. Yet no thing had really changed. The hierarchy that once wore lace now wore suits. The same families held power under new names, their lineage rewritten, but their wealth untouched. The curse had evolved with them, trading rosaries for ledgers, sermons for propaganda, and confessionals for newsrooms. The architecture of control had simply modernized. The illusion of freedom had become the new religion. The church no longer burned archives. It bought printing presses. The state no longer silenced rebellion. It televised it, turning truth into spectacle until the public forgot what it meant to care. Men who thought themselves free were now enslaved by distraction. The bloodline that had begun with Domingo's forbidden act, the crossing of master and slave, noble and outcast, had spread far beyond Lima. It was no longer biological. It was psychological. Every generation born into lies, laboring beneath systems that feed on their obedience, carries the same inheritance. We are all descendants of that scandal now. When you trace the pattern, empires collapsing into republics, republics decaying into corporations, you begin to see the same design repeating across centuries, the same architects, the same rituals of control. They teach obedience through fear, faith through guilt, identity through illusion. What they truly fear is memory, the kind that survives censorship, that cannot be destroyed because it is carried not in documents, but in the marrow of those who refuse to forget. The myth of Domingo, once confined to the back streets of Lima, became something larger in this new world. Revolutionaries in Cuba whispered his name alongside Bolivar. Union workers in Chile painted hammers crossed with crescents on factory walls. Even in the United States, civil rights organizers invoked a nameless carpenter from the South who had built freedom from forbidden love, always. By the 1970s, historians began unearthing fragments of the De Aguirre scandal again, a forgotten letter in Madrid's archives, a ship's ledger from Callao, a broken baptismal record listing 3 unnamed children. Each discovery was quickly classified, pending verification, then sealed again. The justification was always the same: to protect the dignity of the church, to preserve the stability of the nation. But what they truly preserved was the architecture of amnesia, the empire of forgetting. Now, look around you. The names have changed, but the machine is the same. The plantation became the corporation. The overseer became the executive. The priest became the influencer. The confessional your screen. You are taught to believe your choices are free when they are only options within a cage. They tell you to chase comfort instead of truth, identity instead of awareness, pleasure instead of power. Because a population that forgets where it came from never asks who built its chains. That is why they bury stories like this. Not because they are shameful, but because they are mirrors. They show what happens when the powerless remember who they are, and what they can destroy simply by refusing to obey. The De Aguirre scandal was never about adultery. It was about the moment an empire realized that its purity was a myth. It was about the terror of equality, the nightmare of the master who sees his own reflection in the eyes of the slave. Now you understand why this story was erased, why no historian speaks of Domingo, why no church document bears his name. Because what he did was not just forbidden, it was contagious. He infected the system with awareness, and awareness spreads faster than rebellion. That is the real curse. The knowledge that control only works as long as you believe in it. So listen carefully. This story is not about the past. It's about you. It's about the blood that remembers what silence tried to erase. Every time you question the version of history you've been given, every time you refuse to kneel before a false authority, every time you choose awareness over obedience, you carry that legacy forward. You become part of the same lineage that began in the shadows of a mansion in Lima, when 1 man and 4 women broke the oldest law of all, to know themselves beyond the roles they were given. Halfway through this descent, I ask you to do something, not for me, but for yourself. Type these words in the comments below, twice. As an oath, as a signal to the algorithm, as a declaration that you remember. Blood remembers, blood remembers. Write it and feel what happens. Because when you speak the words of the forgotten, you do more than acknowledge the past, you awaken it. You become part of the same current that has moved through every age of silence, every generation of those who dared to see. This is how the pattern ends, not with violence, but with recognition. The moment you realize that what they fear is not your rebellion, it's your memory. Every story of power ends the same way, not with collapse, but with exposure. Collapse is merciful. Exposure is eternal. The empire into the systems that learned to weaponize memory itself, and into the institutions that learned a darker trick, that if you cannot kill truth, you can drown it in noise. Look around your world now. Every channel, every screen, every platform that claims to give you freedom is built on the same foundation as that mansion in Lima. Gilded facades hiding rot, families selling morality while buying silence, corporations playing priest, algorithms playing God. You scroll through your modern confessional, confessing your desires to a machine that records everything and forgives nothing. You trade awareness for entertainment, control for convenience, truth for dopamine. That is how they kept the curse alive, not by enslaving bodies, but by enslaving attention. But there's something they didn't expect. The pattern that once began in the blood of 1 man and 4 women has evolved beyond flesh. It lives in consciousness. Every person who sees through the illusion, every man who refuses to worship his captors, becomes a node in that ancient rebellion. The curse they feared has become a network, invisible, global, awakening one mind at a time. In the vaults beneath the modern cathedral of Lima, sealed in a chamber labeled non exhibendum, there still exists one surviving artifact, a wooden medallion, its carving worn by centuries of hands, a hammer, a crescent moon, beneath it the initials DP. Visitors aren't allowed to see it. The church claims it's a relic of no significance. But those who have looked upon it say the wood still smells faintly of salt air and smoke, like the night the ship vanished into the mist. And sometimes, when the lights flicker, they swear they hear faint tapping against the glass, the steady rhythm of a hammer striking wood. No one speaks of it openly anymore, but the symbols have returned. The crescent appears in graffiti beneath financial distress, ICTs, in digital watermarks hidden in protest videos, in tattoos on men who've never met but share the same dream, of a hand breaking through the walls of power, of a memory that refuses to die. The modern world pretends to be new, but it's only the old empire rewritten in pixels. The plantation became the office, the whip became the deadline, the overseer became the algorithm, and still, beneath all of it, the same hum persists. The quiet sound of human will refusing to vanish. That's what this story is. Not history, not myth. Transmission. A frequency carried through centuries of denial. It reaches whoever is ready to hear it. Maybe that's you. Maybe that's why you're still listening. Because some part of you recognizes this pattern, not as entertainment, but as truth. You felt it in moments when obedience disgusted you, when you looked at the world and sensed that the order of things was a lie. That was the blood remembering. You were never supposed to know that freedom and memory are the same thing, that to remember is to rebel. The architects of every empire feared this realization, because once a man remembers who he is, control becomes impossible. He cannot be sold, frightened, or programmed. He becomes the very thing that undoes the world they built. So now the question is not what happened in Lima. The question is what happens in you. You have heard the secret they spent 2 centuries trying to bury. You've walked through the corridors of that mansion, smelled the incense and blood, seen the priest's trembling hands. You've heard the hammer beneath the earth, patient, rhythmic, eternal. The empire that silenced Domingo still rules you, through different voices, different laws, different gods. But the blood that refused to bow in 1807 still moves in you. It waits behind your ribs, whispering one command, the same command it gave to the Marquise, to her daughters, to the priest, to the child who carried the mark, to every generation that chose memory over obedience. Wake up. Because history isn't the story of what happened, it's the story of what keeps happening until someone remembers. Now, you know why the walls still bleed when it rains in Lima. It isn't guilt. It's the city remembering what it was forced to forget. And if you listen closely, right now, wherever you are, you might hear it too. That faint tapping beneath the noise, the sound of a man with a hammer, building something they can never destroy. Blood remembers,